Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Caldwell thought when he first saw her moving through Sacred Heart's ICU at 2 in the morning. Just a quiet woman in soft-soled shoes, unremarkable, background noise in the machinery of modern medicine. He had no idea. Neither did anyone else on the night shift. Sarah Chen's hands moved with the precision of someone who had learned efficiency under conditions where hesitation meant death. She checked the 4 line in room 312 without speaking, her fingers steady as surgical lasers as she assessed the young Marine's dressing. The bandage was holding. The wound beneath, 3 weeks old, jagged edges from shrapnel that had found him in Fallujah 15 years ago, was healing the way clean tissue heals when someone knows exactly what they're doing. She adjusted his morphine drip with the focused attention most people reserved for defusing bombs. Which, she thought without irony, was not an unfamiliar skill to her. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song above the ICU beds. Monitors beeped in staggered rhythm. A ventilator wheezed its mechanical breath in room 314. Sarah moved between them like water, present but unobtrusive, her presence changing nothing about the room's atmosphere except that somehow, beneath the panic and uncertainty, things became slightly more survivable. The other nurses had stopped noticing her years ago. She preferred it that way. At 2:53 a.m., she watered the dying succulent on the nurses' station with the same quiet discipline she applied to everything else. The plant was brown at the edges, half its leaves gone, and she treated it like a patient. Small sips of water. Careful light. The kind of attention most people reserved for things they believed could recover. She'd been carrying it for 3 months now, watching it decline with the same steady acceptance she brought to everything. There was a problem, you did what you could, and sometimes the outcome was determined long before you arrived. The young Marine in room 312 had been watching her for 3 days. She'd noticed it on the second day, the way his eyes tracked her movements with an intensity that suggested recognition struggling to surface through sedation and pain medication. He was lucid enough now to speak, though mostly he slept. His chart indicated traumatic brain injury from an IED strike near the Anbar province, shrapnel wounds to the left shoulder and ribs. Stable. Healing. His medical record said his name was Captain James Reeves, decorated Marine, 27 years old, nobody next of kin listed. What his chart didn't say was that she knew him. What his chart would never say was that she'd pulled him from a burning Humvee 2 decades ago when he was just a terrified private and she was something else entirely. But that was then. This was the night shift at Sacred Heart, and Sarah Chen was just a nurse. Her shift had started at 8 p.m. She'd arrived through the employee entrance on the east side of the hospital, the one fewer people used, passing through corridors that felt like familiar territory. She'd been walking these hallways for 18 years, and not once had anyone asked her real name. Sarah was enough. The competent one. The quiet one. The one who never made mistakes with medication doses, who somehow knew which patients were about to decompensate before the monitors even registered it, who could talk a combative patient down without raising her voice, who moved through crisis with the kind of calm that came from having already survived the worst. The problem was that her competence was becoming visible to the wrong people. Dr. Marcus Caldwell arrived for early rounds at 5:15 a.m. He was new to Sacred Heart, only 6 months in the position of chief of surgery, and he'd been observing the hospital's rhythms with the calculating focus of someone mapping power structures. He moved through the ICU with expensive shoes that clicked against the tile floor with military precision, his white coat tailored to emphasize his lean frame, his stethoscope draped like a status symbol. Behind him came the residents and the fellows, the hierarchy made physical, and behind them came silence. People adjusted their posture in his presence. Sarah was adjusting vitals on room 308, a post-op patient, 72 hours after spinal fusion, breathing steadily, stat stable, when she sensed his entrance. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She had learned to read rooms the way some people read books, understanding the atmospheric pressure changes that meant authority had entered, understanding the difference between ordinary and dangerous. Caldwell carried the kind of danger that came wrapped in privilege and ambition. He watched her for 11 minutes. She didn't know the exact count, she hadn't been counting consciously, but her situational awareness had been honed across 2 decades of vigilance, and she'd learned to timestamp things without effort. He stood at the nurse's station and observed her work. She could feel his gaze the way prey animals feel predators, and she understood, in that clinical way she understood most things, that she had made a mistake. She'd been too competent. She'd been too visible. She'd let someone see her doing something she shouldn't have been able to do. Room 312. That was the mistake. She'd gone to check on the Marine at 4:48 a.m. when his monitor showed a slight elevation in heart rate and respiratory rate. Most nurses would have adjusted his pain medication and moved on. Sarah had done something different. She'd assessed the wound itself, checking for signs of infection or hemorrhage that the vitals hadn't yet reflected. She'd done it with hands that moved with the economical precision of trauma medicine, not hospital nursing. She'd palpated the tissue around the shrapnel wound with the focused assessment of someone trained in field surgery assessment. She'd seen what was coming before it arrived, a shadow of cellulitis at the wound margin, the earliest sign of infection, caught at a stage where it could be prevented rather than treated. And Caldwell had been walking past room 312 at exactly that moment. He'd paused. He'd watched her assess the wound with her eyes closed, reading tissue the way cardiologists read EKGs. He'd seen her open her eyes and place a single phone call to radiology requesting an ultrasound to rule out subcutaneous hematoma, her voice low and flat and certain, a voice that didn't request so much as order. That voice was the problem. "Just needs wound assessment," she'd said to the radiology tech when he answered the phone. "Infection risk. 0800 if you can manage it." Not a question. Not a plea. A statement of fact from someone accustomed to being obeyed. Caldwell had moved on, but not before Sarah felt the calculation shifting in his mind. She understood it the way she understood vital signs, that moment when a doctor realizes a nurse knows something they don't, or worse, that a nurse is making decisions without asking permission first. By 5:16 a.m., as the morning shift began filtering in with their coffee cups and their soft conversation, Sarah had completed her documentation and her shift change report. She stood at the nurse's station reviewing charts, her fingers steady as she turned pages, her posture the perfect picture of subservience. But her eyes were tracking Caldwell as he moved through the ICU, and she understood with absolute clarity that the calculus had changed. He was watching her now. Cataloging her. Identifying her not as an asset but as a threat to the hierarchy he was constructing. And the look on his face, cold, assessing, the kind of calculation that preceded action, told her that this wouldn't end with observation. She placed her hand over the faded unit patch sewn inside her white coat's lining, the one worn smooth from 20 years of hiding. The fabric was rough beneath her fingertips, and she felt it the way some people felt rosaries, a tether to something she'd promised never to be again. The problem was that promises made in peacetime were a luxury she might not be able to keep. The post-op patient in room 412 was crashing, though nobody but Sarah had noticed yet. His vitals were drifting, BP creeping down in increments so small they'd be invisible to anyone scanning the monitor from across the room. The wound site showed early signs of infection despite Caldwell's discharge order written just 6 hours earlier. Sarah stood at the bedside at 11 p.m., reading the subtle language of a body in distress the way other people read text messages. The skin around the surgical site carried a faint heat. Not fever yet. Just warning. She found Caldwell in the physician's lounge, the kind of space that smelled like burnt coffee and the particular exhaustion of people who wielded power. He was reviewing charts on a tablet, his Rolex catching the fluorescent light with the kind of deliberate gleam that suggested he checked the reflection often. "The Garcia patient in 412, Sarah said quietly. "I'm recommending he stay another 72 hours. Caldwell didn't look up. "Discharge order is written. His wound integrity is compromised. Temperature's normal now, but his temperature is normal." Caldwell set down the tablet with the precision of someone placing a weapon on a table. "Which means there is no infection. Which means he goes home. Are we clear, Chen?" Sarah kept her hand steady on the chart. One breath. "I've assisted in 847 surgical cases over 8 years. I know the warning signs before they become critical. You've assisted, Caldwell said, each word arriving like a boot heel on tile. You didn't decide. You didn't cut. You held retractors and watched from the periphery. He finally looked at her, and his eyes carried the peculiar coldness of someone who'd already decided you were beneath consideration. When you finish nursing school, perhaps you'll understand medical judgment. Until then, stay in your lane. The words landed exactly where they were supposed to land. Sarah felt the impact the way a trained operative feels a near miss, registered, catalogued, filed away. She nodded once and left without responding. Behind her, Caldwell smiled. He'd drawn first blood, and he knew it. The patient in 412 was discharged at 6 a.m. By 8:45 that same morning, he was in the ER with septic shock, his blood pressure dropping like a stone, fever spiking to 104.8 degrees, the infection Sarah had predicted now raging through his system like wildfire. It would take 3 units of blood and emergency debridement to save his life. The damage was done. The narrative was set. At 7 a.m. shift change, with 20 staff members gathered around the unit board for morning huddle, Caldwell arrived with a red marker. He wrote in letters large enough to be read from the hallway, Chen, insubordination. Beneath it, he'd drawn a line and written in his architectural handwriting, questions medical decisions without authority. Recommended for performance review. The room went dead silent. Sarah stood at the periphery of the group, still in her night shift scrubs, and felt rather than saw the collective intake of breath. In hospitals, the unit board was sacred space, clinical information, never personal. Writing someone up in front of the entire morning shift wasn't management. It was public execution by marker and paper. For the record, Caldwell announced to the room, not looking at Sarah, Nurse Chen expressed concern about Mr. Garcia's discharge last evening. Mr. Garcia is now in the ICU with sepsis. The discharge decision was medically sound. The concern was not. He turned, and his smile carried teeth. Sometimes, Chen, inexperience manifests as doubt. That's what happens when people forget their place in the hierarchy. Sarah's jaw tightened, just slightly, just barely visible. A single tear escaped her left eye, and she wiped it away without breaking eye contact, without looking down, without giving him the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. Her hands remained at her sides, steady as surgical instruments. I've been exactly where I need to be, doctor, she said, her voice arriving at a pitch that seemed to drop the room temperature by degrees. The tone wasn't deferential. It wasn't angry. It was something else entirely, the flat calm of someone speaking from a place of absolute certainty. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the morning shift dispersed, and nobody met Sarah's eyes. The isolation began immediately and spread like contagion. By the following Wednesday, during rounds in room 408, Caldwell orchestrated the second strike. The Garcia family was there, Mrs. Garcia's elderly mother, 3 adult children, a grandson holding a balloon that said "Get well soon" in Spanish. They'd been anxious and afraid after the emergency readmission, looking for someone to explain what had gone wrong. Sarah was explaining post-discharge monitoring protocols, her voice steady, her explanations precise and calibrated to family understanding, when Caldwell swept in like a weather system changing pressure. "The quiet mouse is confusing you," he said to the family, his voice pitched to include everyone. "Her limited nursing education doesn't cover complex post-operative cases. The real expertise in this room wears a white coat." He glanced at Sarah with contempt so theatrical it seemed almost performative. "Isn't that right, mouse? Perhaps you should stick to bedpans and vital signs where your training actually qualifies you." Sarah's hands remained steady on the chart. She could feel the family's eyes shifting, suddenly uncertain of her credibility, suddenly aware they'd been receiving information from someone Caldwell had just positioned as beneath serious consideration. She took one measured breath. "The patient deserves complete information, doctor," she said quietly. "That's what I provide." "What you provide," Caldwell replied, "is nursing care. Not medical judgment." He turned back to the family with a smile that was supposed to be reassuring. I'll review everything with you personally." As he began his explanation, which covered roughly the same ground Sarah had already covered, only slower and with more jargon, Sarah excused herself and returned to the charting station. Her fingers moved across the keyboard mechanically, documenting what had just occurred in clinical language. The words felt hollow. She'd learned long ago that writing down the truth and having it matter were two entirely different things. By the end of the second week, the break room had become a geography of avoidance. Sarah would enter and within minutes it would empty, not obviously, not all at once, but with the coordinated precision of a unit executing withdrawal. Nurse Melissa Davis had been friendly before, the kind of colleague who brought homemade cookies on birthdays. Now Davis suddenly needed to check on a patient whenever Sarah sat down with her cracked ceramic mug. The mug had a chip on the rim and a faded logo from a medical conference in San Antonio, the only possession from her old life that didn't scream classified or compartmentalized. Sarah ate her lunch alone at a table positioned near the window, watching the November rain streak the glass like brushstrokes. Her fingers found the inside of her white coat, where she'd sewn the unit patch years ago, a faded thing, barely larger than a postage stamp, embroidered with symbols that no one at Sacred Heart would recognize. Just fabric. Just thread. Just a tether to a version of herself she'd promised never to be again. The whispers had started in the hallways. Caldwell called HR about anyone seen with her. Career suicide. Don't associate with Chen, it gets flagged. By the third week, even the resident stopped making eye contact. The attending physicians who'd previously nodded in greeting now found sudden urgency in chart reviews when she passed. Sarah had been made radioactive through a kind of social alchemy that required no evidence, no documentation, just a superior officer with institutional leverage and the patience to apply it gradually. She continued working with mechanical precision. Her medication passes were perfect. Her charting was immaculate. Her patient assessments were still the most accurate on the unit. But now she was doing it in isolation, watched but not acknowledged, present but invisible. Caldwell appeared at the break room one afternoon as Sarah was leaving, her shift finished, her cardigan pulled tight. "Comfortable?" he asked, his voice carrying amusement. "You'll have plenty of time alone to reflect on hierarchy." He smiled like he'd said something clever. "That's where people like you belong, Chen. Quiet. Compliant. Grateful for the work." Sarah walked past him without responding. But her mind was already calculating the math of how much longer she could maintain her cover, how long the seals on her classified records would hold, what would happen to this careful life she'd constructed if anyone started digging deep enough. The next morning, when she arrived for her shift, she found her schedule had changed. She was no longer assigned to the ICU. Instead, she'd been moved to night float, covering for units simultaneously, ICU, surgical floors, telemetry, and post-operative recovery. The change had no justification listed, no reason provided, just a new schedule posted by the scheduler who wouldn't make eye contact when Sarah asked about it. "Orders from above," the woman had whispered, and then turned away. "For units. 1 nurse. Simultaneously." It was the scheduling equivalent of sabotage, make the work impossible, document the failures, build a paper trail of incompetence. Sarah understood the strategy immediately. She'd used similar tactics in Raleigh, though the stakes had been considerably higher than a nursing career. She worked that night float assignment the way she worked everything, with the kind of endurance that came from years of operating on adrenaline and muscle memory. Running between floors, prioritizing through 12 different alarm systems, managing crisis triage with the tactical awareness of someone who'd done this under fire with actual bullets rather than liability insurance. By 2 a.m., in the post-op recovery unit, she was moving between beds at a pace that would have been impossible for any normal human. But she wasn't normal, and her body knew how to operate on the edges of exhaustion the way most people knew how to make coffee. In room 312, though, something was changing. The young Marine, Captain Marcus Webb, according to his chart, transferred 3 days ago after motorcycle accident surgery, was awake. He watched her sprint past his door for the third time in an hour, and something in the fluid precision of her movement, the economy of motion, the way her eyes catalogued every room in 3-second intervals, triggered something deep in his memory. Sand. Heat. Smoke so thick it turned day into dusk. A woman's voice cutting through the chaos, steady and absolute, calling medical directives in a tone that meant survival. He pressed the call button. Sarah appeared 3 minutes later, her face composed and professional, every trace of emotion locked behind a wall of clinical competence. Webb stared at her face, older now, the bone structure slightly different, but something essential unchanged. "That woman," he said quietly, his voice hoarse from anesthesia. "Chen. How long has she worked here?" The aide checking his monitor paused. 8 years. Why? Webb's hands trembled slightly as he looked back at the doorway where Sarah had already disappeared, moving toward the next crisis. "I know her," he whispered. I know her." That night, after his shift was over and the hospital had quieted to the particular stillness of 3 a.m., Webb pulled out his phone. It was an old number, one he hadn't called since his medical discharge, but the kind of number you never really forget. His commanding officer, no, his former commanding officer, picked up on the second ring despite the hour. "Webb," the voice said. "Just the name." "No question." "Sir, I need you to look up a name for me." "Sarah Chen. Nurse. She works at Sacred Heart Hospital in Raleigh." There was a pause. A very long pause. Webb could hear the sound of someone opening what sounded like a secure database, typing with precision, then stopping. "Where exactly did you say you are?" the voice asked carefully. "Raleigh. The hospital is called Sacred Heart." "Sir, I know this woman." I know her, but the memory it's fragmented." "Remedy maybe?" "She saved us." "She saved me." The pause this time stretched longer. When his commander spoke again, the voice had changed, become more careful, more measured, more like someone speaking about things that were never supposed to be spoken about at all. "I'm sending someone to you," the commander said. "Don't ask anyone else about Chen. Don't call anyone else." "And Webb?" "Don't let her leave that hospital." The line went dead. The paramedics came through the ER doors at 11:11 p.m. with the young Marine on their stretcher, chest not rising, skin the color of wet concrete, vitals flatlined except for the frantic electrical noise the monitor made in protest. Mr. Hernandez. 32 years old. Discharged 6 hours earlier by Dr. Caldwell despite Sarah's recommendation to observe another 48 hours. The post-op wound infection had progressed to septic shock in the parking lot while his wife was retrieving the car. Sarah heard the code call crackling through the intercom as she restocked the night triage station. She didn't hesitate. Her feet moved toward Trauma Bay 3 before her brain finished processing the announcement, and when she rounded the corner and saw the patient's face, pale, jaw slack, chest silent, she didn't see a failure of medicine. She saw the work ahead. "Talk to me," she said, her voice dropping into the register she hadn't used in 2 decades, the one that made people listen without knowing why. The ER resident looked up, flustered. "Sepsis. Discharged earlier against nursing assessment. Infected surgical site. He crashed in the airway secured. Not yet. We're preparing for intubation but his O2 sat is." Sarah was already moving. Her hands reached for the equipment tray with the precision of someone who had done this in the dark, in sandstorms, with rounds coming in from 3 directions. Muscle memory took over. The kind of memory that didn't fade no matter how quiet you stayed, how invisible you tried to be. She prepped the 7.0 endotracheal tube, the tube itself smooth against her palm, the stylet sliding in with a whisper, and her eyes found the landmarks on his throat like a pilot reading a runway at night. The ER resident stepped back. People did that around her. They always had. "Propofol, 100 milligrams for, push it now," Sarah said. Not a request. Not a question. The med tech moved without hesitation. The tube went in on the first pass. Clean. The ventilator's soft mechanical breathing filled the bay, and his oxygen saturation began climbing from the 52 that had nearly killed him. 65, 72. 78. Her hands were already moving to the next problem, the source of sepsis, the infected wound site beneath his bandage that had been sealed with Caldwell's confidence and nothing else. "We need to explore the wound," Sarah said, glancing at the resident. "Now." Broad-spectrum antibiotics, start vancomycin, 15 mg per kilogram. "What's his weight?" 92 kilograms. 1,380 mg for push. Then piperacillin tazobactam. "We're assuming polymicrobial infection until culture says otherwise." She moved to the bedside, pulled on sterile gloves with the snap of someone who had dressed 100 wounds in emergency conditions, and began carefully removing the dressing. The infection underneath was aggressive. Necrotic tissue. The telltale purple-black edema of tissue death. The smell hit her, sweet, copper-tinged, the specific scent of systemic failure. She'd smelled it in Ramadi on soldiers who'd been hit by IEDs 3 days prior, when blood pooled in the sand and antibiotics were still 3 hours away by helicopter. "We need to get him to the OR," Sarah said. "Call surgery. Tell them we're debriding this site now, aggressive lavage, and his septic. We need to move." The ER resident was staring at her. "You're a night triage nurse. You can't." "Watch." Sarah was already irrigating the wound with sterile saline, her other hand holding suction steady as tissue came away. The surgical attending appeared in the doorway 30 seconds later. Someone must have called, and took one look at the field Sarah had exposed and nodded. "Good work," he said quietly, and the 3 words carried more weight than they should have because she understood what he was really saying, *ICU. The surgery took 4 hours. Sarah stayed until Hernandez was extubated in the ICU, his color returning, his oxygen saturation holding steady at 96%. The infection was contained. He would walk out of this hospital in 2 weeks. Because of her. She clocked out at 7:15 a.m., pulled off her scrubs in the locker room, and didn't notice that Dr. Caldwell had entered the break room until he was already leaning against the counter, watching her with something that looked like a smile but felt like a threat. His presence moved the air in a small space like a door slamming shut. "Impressive performance last night," Caldwell said. His voice was smooth, the tone of a man who'd rehearsed what he was about to say. "Very theatrical. Very committed to your little hero fantasy." He straightened, stepped closer. His cologne was expensive and chemical, like something designed to announce status. "But that's exactly the problem, isn't it? You don't know your place." Sarah buttoned her regular shirt with methodical care. One button at a time. Seam aligned perfectly. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't change. The tear would come later when she was alone, but not now. Not in front of him. "I've been exactly where I need to be, Doctor," she said, meeting his eyes with the kind of calm that came from having stared down men with weapons, with authority, with the power to end lives. Her voice was steady. Almost gentle. Which somehow made it more devastating. The words hung in the break room like a scalpel suspended in air. Something flickered across Caldwell's face, not fear exactly, but a glimpse of recognition that he'd just been read in a way he didn't understand. That Sarah Chen contained dimensions he couldn't measure or control. His jaw tightened. "You exceeded your scope of practice," Caldwell said, recovering, his voice hardening. "That's grounds for immediate termination. I'm filing a formal incident report, unauthorized advanced procedures, creating liability through reckless intervention. You'll be hearing from HR on Monday." He turned toward the door. "Your shift assignments are being changed. Effective immediately, you're reassigned to overnight triage. No ICU access. No patient care beyond triage screening. For everyone's safety." He left without waiting for a response. Sarah inhaled once, slow and deliberate. Exhaled. She reached up with the back of her hand and pressed it against her left eye, and when her hand came away, it carried a single tear that she'd permitted herself. Just one. Her vision remained clear. Her hands remained steady. She could feel the faded unit patch through the lining of her jacket, the one sewn into the fabric like a secret bone in the body of her disguise, the symbol of the team she'd carried through 2 decades of silence, the unit designation from a city called Raleigh where she'd learned that sometimes the quietest people in the room were the ones holding everything together. Outside, the rain had stopped. Through the break room window, she could see the parking lot where Hernandez had collapsed. An ambulance pulled out toward the main road, heading back into the city with its next patient. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed their constant hum, indifferent to her promotion and her demotion, indifferent to everything except the work. She checked her phone. An email from HR marked urgent, received at 6:08 a.m., disciplinary hearing scheduled, Monday 9 a.m. Potential termination. Sarah stared at the words on the screen. She'd spent 20 years not drawing attention to herself, 2 decades of deliberate invisibility, and it had come to this anyway. The protocol she'd been ordered to maintain, stay buried, never surface, never use the skills that had made her dangerous, had failed. Caldwell had found her, had marked her, had begun the process of erasing her. And she couldn't fight back without breaking the silence order that would bring federal agents to her door. Across the city, in a nondescript office building, Captain Webb sat in front of a secure terminal with his phone pressed to his ear. His voice was urgent, younger than it should have been for the weight of what he was asking. "Sir, I need you to run a facial recognition against Operation Phantom Fury personnel files. Cross-reference with current civilian employment in the Raleigh area. I know this is irregular, but I need confirmation on something." The voice on the other end belonged to a Navy SEAL commander, someone with access to classified archives that most people didn't know existed. "Give me the details," the commander said. "There's a nurse at Sacred Heart Hospital. Sarah Chen. And sir, I'm almost certain she pulled me out of a burning Humvee in Fallujah 20 years ago. She was running tactical medical for JSOC at the time. If I'm right, her name back then was..." "Say it." "Viper 6. The silence on the line lasted 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, the commander pulled up files that had been buried deeper than most classified documents go, accessed after classified access, sealed after sealed. The photograph was there. Younger face, but unmistakable. Combat-worn eyes that hadn't changed because eyes like that never change once you've seen what they've seen. "I'm pulling personnel records," the commander said. "Don't speak to her. Don't approach her. If that's really Viper 6, she's supposed to be off the books completely. Federal silence order. Where she is right now is where she's supposed to be." He paused. "But if someone's forcing her hand, if someone's making her visible, there are people who need to know that. Starting with JSOC." The line went quiet except for the sound of keyboard clicks, the hum of secure servers, and the beginning of a phone chain that would, by dawn, bring the machinery of military intelligence down on Raleigh like thunder. Thursday evening at 11:48 p.m., rain hammered against the ICU windows like artillery. Sarah was restocking the crash cart when she heard it, not a scream, something worse. The absence of sound. Monitors still beeping. Ventilators still hissing. But all the human noise stopped at once. She straightened, hands pausing over the defibrillator pads. In 20 years of nursing, she'd learned that silence was a weapon. The man who burst through the ICU doors was 7 feet tall, built like a diesel truck, wearing a soaked jacket that hung heavy with rain and something else. His eyes had the particular brightness of someone running on methamphetamine and desperation. The .45 caliber pistol in his right hand swept across the room like a conductor's baton, and that's when the screaming started. "Oxy. Fentanyl. Everything you got. Now." His voice shook with the tremor of someone who hadn't slept in days, each word edged with the kind of panic that made people dangerous. Nurses scattered. Mrs. Chen in bed pulled her blanket over her head. The monitoring tech dove behind the desk. Sarah saw it all in the peripheral while keeping her hands visible, the instinctive flight response, the narrowing of options, the moment when a room transforms into a pressure cooker. She stepped into the corridor. The gunman's head snapped toward her. For a fraction of a second, his weapon dipped, which told her everything. He was looking for fear. What he found instead was a woman with her hands raised, empty palms forward, moving toward him with the calm of someone who had walked into worse with nothing but a medical kit and a prayer. "Lower the weapon," Sarah said, and her voice dropped 3 octaves, not louder, but deeper, hitting frequencies that didn't belong in a civilian hospital. Command voice. Tactical voice. The voice of someone who had ordered men into fire. The gunman's eyes widened. For just a moment, something flickered across his face, recognition, maybe, of prey that wasn't prey. "Back up, bitch, or I." "You're checking exit routes." Sarah stepped closer, one measured foot in front of the other. "Scanning sight lines." "You've had training." The man's jaw tightened. He grabbed Nurse Davis by the collar, yanked her in front of him as a shield, the pistol pressed against her temple. "You think I'm joking? I think you're scared." Sarah's hand stayed raised, fingers spread, completely open. "I think you came in here with a plan that's already falling apart. I think you know how this ends." He turned toward her, just a quarter turn, the weapon momentarily tracking away as he tried to establish dominance, and Sarah's body moved the way it had moved 1,000 times before, muscle memory older than her nursing license, older than her carefully constructed quiet life. 3 movements. Economical. Brutal. Precise. First, she closed the distance with a side step that eliminated his firing angle. Second, she locked his wrist with her left hand while her right drove upward into his elbow, hyperextending the joint past tolerance. Third, she rotated her hips and dropped her weight, using his own arm as leverage to drive him face-first into the linoleum. The pistol clattered away, spinning under a supply cart. The whole sequence took for seconds. The man lay unconscious on the floor, his breathing steady, his right arm bent at an angle that suggested he'd need orthopedic surgery. His forehead had a small cut from the fall. No permanent damage. Sarah had been precise about that too. The ICU went absolutely still. The monitors seemed to scream louder in the silence. Nurse Davis was hyperventilating, her hand over her mouth. The tech called security on the overhead. A resident stood frozen in the doorway, staring at Sarah like she'd just watched a ghost perform a magic trick. Sarah's hands were already moving, checking vitals on the unconscious man, controlling the scene, keeping everyone safe, when she saw Dr. Caldwell emerge from the stairwell. He'd been watching on the camera feed from safety. That was the only explanation for his timing, the only reason he'd appear now, when the threat was neutralized and everything should have been gratitude. He stood there in his perfectly pressed shirt, watching her with the calculation of someone who'd just watched his narrative collapse and was already rebuilding it. Within 15 minutes, he had the hospital administrator on the phone. Sarah heard him from the hallway, his voice smooth as silk over venom, vigilante violence. Unprecedented liability. She could have killed him. She could have killed staff. "We need legal counsel immediately." By the time Raleigh police finished their statements and the unconscious gunman was in custody with a broken arm and concussion, Sarah was called to the administrator's office on the 3rd floor. Caldwell was already there, sitting beside Mr. Harrison, the hospital's chief administrator, both of them arranged like judges. "Ms. Chen." Harrison's voice was carefully neutral, which meant he'd been briefed on his legal exposure. "Effective immediately, you're terminated for reckless endangerment and assault. Security will escort you to collect your personal effects." Sarah took one breath. Then another. She didn't mention the federal silence order, the scrubbed military records, the 20-year directive that made her legally invisible. She couldn't surface. She couldn't defend herself. If she opened that door, if she invoked anything classified, she'd spend the next decade in a federal holding cell and every person in this room would wake up tomorrow with attorneys and security clearances. "I understand," she said, and her voice was quiet again, the nurse voice, the small voice, the one that knew how to disappear. Caldwell's mouth twitched at the corner. He'd won. By midnight, Sarah stood at the bus stop on Henderson Street in the rain. The cardboard box in her arms contained everything that mattered: a cracked ceramic mug with faded lettering that said "World's Okayest Nurse," the dying succulent with brown-edged leaves that had sat in her locker for 3 years, and a photograph in a plastic sleeve, for faces in desert camouflage, dust on their shoulders, smiling in the way that soldiers smile when they know the next moment might be the last. She didn't cry. She just stood there under the bus shelter, rain soaking through her jacket to the faded unit patch sewn inside the lining, the one her team wore the day they saved Raleigh. Her breath fogged in the November cold. A bus rolled past without stopping. Then another. By the time 3 a.m. arrived, she was still standing there, a ghost finally fading completely. Across town, in the hospital she'd bled for, Caldwell's smear campaign was spreading through email, forwarded chains with subject lines like "safety concern" and "incident summary." The message was simple: dangerous, unstable, unemployable. By morning, she wouldn't be hireable at any medical facility in a 3-state radius. But that wasn't the moment when everything changed. That moment came at 6:51 a.m., when the thud-thud-thud of rotor wash shook Sacred Heart's windows hard enough to rattle the 4 poles. A Black Hawk descended through the rain clouds, scattering autumn leaves across the parking lot like confetti. Armed soldiers in tactical gear sealed every entrance: north doors, south doors, emergency exits, administrative access. The hospital's security team watched in confusion as military personnel moved with the coordinated precision of Delta operators. Dr. Caldwell was in the administrator's office, still spinning his narrative, still building his hero story, when the boot started echoing down the corridor. Heavy. Rhythmic. Military cadence. The door opened without knock. A Navy SEAL commander entered first, dress uniform so pressed it could cut glass. Behind him came Captain Marcus Webb in marine dress blues, his eyes red-rimmed and determined. Then a stone-faced Army colonel with a file folder marked classified in red letters. And finally, 2 FBI agents carrying laptops. "We're looking for Major Sarah Chen," the SEAL commander said, and his voice filled the room like he'd ordered 1,000 men into Fallujah and 1,000 men had answered. "You may know her as Viper 6. Caldwell's rehearsed smile died on his face. "There's no one here by that." Webb stepped forward, hands trembling as he held the file open. His voice cracked like he was 19 again, screaming in a burning Humvee, "Major Sarah Chen. Special Forces Medical Operations. 20 years ago, I was Private Marcus Webb. She pulled me from a burning vehicle under sniper fire. She saved my life." The colonel opened his file: parade ground formal, 2 silver stars. Bronze star with Valor. Purple heart. For classified commendations. Operation Phantom Fury. Caldwell's face was draining of color. The FBI agent stepped forward with a laptop displaying code, browser history, database access logs, "and we've been watching you attempt to forge military personnel records for the past 6 hours, Dr. Caldwell. That's federal crime. Multiple counts." Captain Webb's hands shook as he dialed the number at 2:19 a.m., standing in his apartment with the hospital discharge papers spread across his kitchen table. 20 years. 20 years since Raleigh, since the burning Humvee, since a major with steady hands and a voice like tempered steel pulled him from flames that should have killed him. He'd recognized her the moment she walked into his room at Sacred Heart, not just from the scar on her left forearm, the one she got pulling him clear, but from the way she moved, the way her eyes catalogued every variable in a room before acknowledging she was in it. The name was different now. The uniform was gone. But the competence was unmistakable. He found the number in his classified contacts, the one the Pentagon said he should never use unless someone's life depended on it, and made the call that would change everything. By 6:15 a.m., the morning was split open by rotor wash. A Black Hawk descended toward the Sacred Heart parking lot like judgment itself, its shadow consuming 3 full sections of asphalt. Armed soldiers in full tactical gear moved with silent precision, establishing a perimeter around the main entrance. Hospital security watched in bewildered silence as these men, faces hard as granite, rifles held with the casual competence of people who'd used them in actual war, sealed the building. No one was coming in. No one was going out. Nurses on the night shift stopped their charting. Residents froze mid-thought. The ICU went still except for the mechanical rhythm of ventilators and the distant thump of rotors that shook the fluorescent lights like thunder made solid. In Administrator Chen's office, no, that's what she'd been calling herself for 2 decades, Dr. Marcus Caldwell was in the middle of spinning his narrative to the hospital board chair and 3 attorneys when the door opened without a knock. A Navy SEAL commander walked in wearing dress blues with the weight of wars behind his eyes. Behind him came a stone-faced Army colonel with silver oak leaves and medals that covered his chest like armor plating. Then came FBI Special Agent Morrison, credentials already in hand, a laptop case gripped like it contained the future of his freedom. Caldwell stood up from his chair, face still arranged in the expression of wounded authority he'd been perfecting all morning, the noble surgeon defending hospital protocol against reckless endangerment. "I've explained the situation," Caldwell began, addressing the commander with the tone he used on nurses he wanted to intimidate. The individual in question acted without authorization, endangered multiple patients, and created significant liability for. "Where is Major Chen?" The SEAL commander's voice had the quality of concrete settling. Not a question. A command wrapped in the shape of one. By her call sign. Viper 6. The room didn't just go quiet. It compressed into something dense and suffocating. The board chair's pen fell from her fingers and clattered on the mahogany table. An attorney inhaled sharply. Caldwell's face underwent a transformation that would have been comical if it wasn't the exact moment his entire world began to collapse. "I don't know what you're." The colonel stepped forward, his file folder opening with the precision of a surgical incision. His voice was flat as an operating table. "Major Sarah Chen. 2 silver stars." He paused, letting each medal sit in the air like a separate accusation. "Bronze star with Valor." Another pause. The weight was building now, heavy enough to crush. "Purple Heart." 1 citation. He turned a page. "Second Purple Heart." The folder moved again. "Classified commendations for Operation Phantom Fury. Service record sealed at the Pentagon level." "You understand what that means, Doctor?" Her records don't just belong to the military. They belong to people who don't exist in any public database. Caldwell's mouth had gone the color of old hospital tile. His hand reached for the table's edge as if it could ground him to something real. Then Agent Morrison opened her laptop and turned it toward the room so everyone could see. The screen glowed like evidence itself. "At 11:36 p.m. last night, someone using your hospital credentials and home IP address accessed Department of Defense personnel databases using stolen administrator passwords." She clicked through screens filled with timestamps and access logs. "We've been monitoring dark web military records fraud for 6 months. Your digital fingerprints are all over this." Another click. "You attempted to create false discharge papers for someone named Sarah Chen. You tried to access files marked classified. You searched," she paused, and her voice took on a blade-sharp edge, "for ways to discredit a service member whose records are protected under federal seal." Caldwell's hand moved toward his phone. One of the soldiers who'd been standing silently in the corner, silent the way combat veterans stand, like they're always listening for threats, stepped forward and removed it from the table without touching Caldwell himself. The gesture was so casual, so utterly certain, that it made the room understand immediately what Caldwell had never grasped: he was no longer in control of anything that was about to happen. "You're misinterpreting." Caldwell's voice had changed pitch. It was higher now, thinner, like air escaping from something that had always been mostly hollow. "I was verifying credentials, conducting a basic audit of." "Verify what?" Morrison's voice hit like a shovel against concrete. "A nurse you fired for saving lives? You accessed classified operation files, Dr. Caldwell. Files that don't officially exist. Files that would be worth substantial money to certain parties on the dark web. Files about covert operations in a city called Raleigh where American soldiers were dying and a major named Viper 6 kept them alive." The door opened again. This time it was the chief nursing officer, her expression the kind that makes you understand that every alliance you thought you had has already abandoned you. She was holding a file folder. Behind her came two attorneys, not Caldwell's attorneys, he realized with the sick certainty of a man watching his last support structure collapse. The board chair's attorneys. The original medication logs you altered, the chief nursing officer said, opening the folder with the precision of someone who documented everything. I have the timestamps. I have your access records. You falsified patient documentation. 3 days of records, completely fabricated, all designed to make Nurse Chen look incompetent. One of the board's attorneys stepped forward. We've also received calls from the families you instructed to file complaints against your employee. The ones you said to sign without reading because it was procedural. His voice had the particular cold quality of someone about to destroy you with paperwork and witnesses. They're recanting everything. They're willing to testify that you provided them with false information and encouraged them to lodge fraudulent complaints. That's suborning perjury, Doctor. That's conspiracy. Caldwell tried to speak. His hands had begun to shake, not the controlled tremor of someone under stress, but the chaotic movement of someone whose nervous system had begun to understand that the situation had passed beyond recovery. When he finally managed words, they came out in fragments, the desperate scrambling of a mind that had lost its ability to spin a narrative. You don't understand what she represents, the hierarchy, the order of things. Captain Webb's voice cut through like a rifle round. He'd been standing in the corner the entire time, and no one had noticed him, which was exactly how special operators preferred it. The order of things? She held that order together while men like you sat in safe rooms making phone calls and destroying the people beneath you. The order she maintained kept 12 of my team alive in a city where 3,000 Americans died. The order she kept was the difference between us coming home in boxes or coming home walking. He moved closer. There was no aggression in the movement, just the calm approach of someone who knew exactly where his center of gravity was and how to use it. I've seen a lot of men with rank and credentials, Dr. Caldwell. Most of them were nothing compared to that woman sitting somewhere crying into a cardboard box because you couldn't stand taking orders from someone smarter than you in a field where you'd never trained. You picked a fight with a major in the United States Army Special Forces. That wasn't a career decision. That was a suicide note. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. FBI agent Morrison stood, and two agents who'd been positioned near the door moved forward with the mechanical certainty of people executing a procedure they'd done 100 times before. Dr. Harrison Caldwell, you're under arrest for unauthorized access to federal systems, attempted forgery of military records, and conspiracy to defraud the United States government. The handcuffs went on with 2 clicks that sounded like a door slamming shut on an entire life. His wrists were pulled behind his back, and the expensive Rolex that he'd shown off during morning rounds caught the light one last time before it disappeared. An agent began reading him his rights in the flat tone of someone who'd done it to far worse men. They walked him through the ICU, the very ICU he'd once commanded with contempt and condescension. The unit went silent as he passed. Nurses who'd been bullied into submission, residents who'd been intimidated into compliance, all of them watched him move toward the exit with the uneven gait of someone whose legs weren't quite cooperating anymore. They passed the unit board where a notation in red marker still read, S. Chen, insubordination. They passed room 312, where he'd mocked a nurse he didn't have the moral equipment to exist in the same room with. His $800 shoes squeaked against linoleum with every step, a sound like fear made audible. By the time they reached the parking lot where the Black Hawk still waited with its rotors turning the air into something visible, the morning shift had gathered at the windows. Camera phones were out. Social media was already filling with video. The arrest of Sacred Heart's chief of surgery, the federal vehicles, the soldiers in tactical gear, it would be on local news by noon. By tomorrow, the national outlets would pick it up. By next week, medical ethics boards would be investigating his entire career. Someone finally asked the question everyone was thinking as Caldwell was placed in the back of an FBI vehicle, "Where's Sarah?" Captain Webb already knew. He'd received coordinates before the Black Hawk even touched down. He left the administrator's office without waiting for answers to questions that no longer mattered, moving with the efficiency of someone who had one mission: find Major Sarah Chen and bring her home. He found her 6 miles away at the Eastgate Motel, sitting on the edge of a sagging queen bed in room 147, still wearing rain-soaked scrubs, the cardboard box of her life beside her like an accusation. When she looked up at him, her eyes carried the particular exhaustion of someone who'd been carrying everyone else for so long that collapse felt inevitable. "Major," Webb said, and his voice broke on the rank because it meant something now, meant she could finally be that thing again. "It's time to come home." She shook her head, the movement slow, defeated in a way that shattered something in Webb's chest. "I can't." "The silence order." "The federal." He handed her his phone. On the screen was a Department of Defense document with official seals, dated that morning, bearing the signatures of people with authority that transcended normal institutional hierarchies. Operation Phantom Fury had been declassified. The 20-year silence order was rescinded as of 0600 hours. Sarah Chen was cleared to exist again. 2 years later, Sacred Heart Memorial Hospital held its grand opening of the Sarah Chen Trauma Center. The director, Dr. Sarah Chen, now with her rank officially restored in medical records that could finally acknowledge who she was, stood at the podium in civilian clothes, her old unit patch finally visible, framed on the wall behind her where everyone could see it. The patch her team wore the day they saved a city and a terrified private who'd never forgotten her face. "Trauma doesn't announce itself," she told the assembled crowd of hospital staff, veterans, journalists, and dignitaries. "It comes quietly, in the middle of normal days, and changes everything. My job is to be ready. My job is to be the one who doesn't flinch." Captain Webb sat in the front row in dress blues, medals covering his chest, the scar on his ribs finally able to exist as something other than a secret. When Sarah's eyes found his, they held for a moment, long enough for understanding, long enough for acknowledgement, long enough to remember what they'd survived together. Across town, in a strip mall between a nail salon and a vape shop, Dr. Harrison Caldwell sat at a folding table underneath a sagging banner that read, "Supplemental Insurance, Ask Me How." His medical license revoked. His board connection severed. His reputation dismantled. Watching people walk past without making eye contact, waiting to begin his 18-month federal sentence for crimes that had seemed so justified when he was committing them. Sarah's office at the trauma center had a window where a succulent now thrived, its green leaves unfurling toward light. When she moved through the hallways at night, soft-soled shoes on polished floors, checking on patients with the quiet competence of someone who'd spent 2 decades perfecting the art of saving lives while invisible, the staff didn't step away anymore. They straightened. They made space. A young resident asked her during morning rounds, "Dr. Chen, can you teach me that chest seal technique? The one from your paper on improvised field medicine." Sarah allowed herself the smallest smile, the kind that appeared rarely but carried the weight of having survived the impossible. "First rule," she said, her voice dropping into the register that made you listen whether you wanted to or not. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. Never underestimate silence. Never assume you understand what someone's carrying. She moved on through the trauma center she'd built from nothing, a shadow with purpose finally visible, finally home, finally allowed to be exactly what she'd always been, a warrior who'd chosen to heal instead of destroy, and had somehow found a way to do both without apology. If you've made it this far, you know what it means to recognize hidden strength in the people around you. Subscribe for more stories about the ones the world underestimated. Like this video. Comment below, have you ever been judged by someone who had no idea who they were actually standing next to? Because those are the most satisfying stories of all.